You're listening to Tech Girl Talks, a Playlyst original. Very often when I meet a parent who finds out what I do for a living, working as a gaming content creator and esports commentator, I somehow hear about their problematic child. Honestly, this actually happens more than you'd realize. Parents like to tell me about how their children are addicted to video games, how they steal phones to play, how they can't get them away from the TV or a computer screen. They then proceed to tell me how unhealthy it all is. And as an avid gamer myself, I actually get really annoyed with this because my parents let us, and when I say us, my brother and I, game when we were younger. And granted, we had certain times we were allowed to, but for the most part, my brother and I mean, we turned out fine. I think we're both healthy, self-sustaining adults. It kind of bugs me when I hear the term gaming addiction thrown around. It just doesn't make sense to me, but I do realize that my opinion is just that, an opinion. So do I really understand the impact that video games are having on children and adults? Is it possibly a far bigger issue than even I realize? This CNBC report from September 2021 would seem to say yes. Yes, it is.
It's happening in virtually every developed country in the world. Young people, usually boys, unable to walk away from online video games. It could be Fortnite, Counter-Strike, Minecraft, the list is long, as kids sacrifice family, friends, school, even sleep. For years, China has sent teens to addiction recovery centers. Now it's setting tough new rules for minors 17 and younger, banning online video games on school days, Monday through Thursday. Only 1 hour a day on Fridays, weekends, and holidays. And every gamer must register with an anti-addiction center.
That kind of mandate would not work here in the United States, period, full stop.
But, says Jim Steyer, it's a sign of how serious the problem has become.
That was a beautiful shot.
With few friends around during COVID, 15-year-old James Reichert in Colorado turned to his Xbox for online gaming.
But I got a weekly report and it said he'd been on for like 40 hours.
Now his parents have had to set limits.
He has to have his homework done and his chores, as well as maintain a 3.0 or higher grade point average. Then we will basically unlock the Xbox so he can play because we're able to pause the Wi-Fi to it.
They make us feel really engaged.
Even a Harvard psychiatrist says he too was a gaming addict once.
I grew up playing video games, played a lot of video games when I was in middle school and high school, and almost failed out of college for playing too many video games.
Now, Dr. Alok Kanoja runs the Healthy Gamer Mental Health Platform. He estimates 10% of teenage gamers are addicted. Often, the addiction hides low self-esteem issues.
They have difficulty with social interactions, which then just gets worse the more that they play games. That a lot of times video games serve as an escape to something else.
The gaming industry tells NBC News it supports digital wellness, adding nearly all video game devices offer parental controls, which allow them to set time limits. Common Sense Media says it's time for a national PSA push, teaching teens and parents of the dangers of too much online gaming.
At Common Sense, we strongly recommend a public awareness campaign around video game usage that's similar to what we did with kids and tobacco and smoking.
A campaign to wean kids off of their online addiction.
I thought the best way to really actually delve into this would be to reach out to someone far more qualified than me to answer some of the questions and possibly concerns people have around gaming and this idea of gaming addiction. So I hunted down a shrink.
Chris Kemp, I'm a clinical psychologist. I work with adolescents and in private practice with adults as well. And I also play potentially unhealthy amount of video games.
Chris is actually a personal friend, so full disclosure there. But he was kind enough to agree to answer some of my questions and actually just give a more educated view on what a gaming addiction is. In fact, right off the bat, I wanted him to clarify if there was even such a thing as a gaming addiction because I was somewhat apprehensive.
I guess it depends entirely on how you quantify or how you sort of like ratify whether something is real or not. So when we talk about like mental disorders, like the most like sort of quantitative kind of approach we have is the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. So that's basically where all psychiatric conditions are in place. So internet gaming disorder is currently not in the newest edition of the DSM, which is the DSM-5, but it is in the section which is like conditions for future study or whatever. I am pretty sure that it will be in the next one. And I also would say, just from my own experience, that I definitely think using the general criteria for addiction, that gaming can certainly be qualified under that. So do I think it's a real thing? Absolutely. Do I think that it's potentially overused or sort of like over accused? If people are wrongfully accused of being gaming addicts a lot, probably as well, especially from parents potentially. But yeah, it absolutely can become a problematic thing that would qualify it as a disorder.
So fair enough. Gaming addictions are real things, with a few caveats we'll ultimately deep dive into as this episode progresses. I do get somewhat frustrated when I listen to reports like the CNBC one you heard earlier, where a large amount of gaming time is reported as being tantamount to something like smoking. I mean, I just can't wrap my head around the idea that playing too many games, spending hours playing games, is the same as smoking cigarettes.
Yeah, I feel like that's a bad point of comparison. I think a much better one would be like a gambling addiction, right? Because smoking has a physical component, whereas a gambling addiction is something we all know of as very real, but there's no physical component. You're basically just addicted to that reward system or that kind of thrill or that sort of serotonin dump of the excitement of winning, or for a lot of people the risk of losing is exciting as well. So I think that's a much better point of comparison, because I think gaming addiction functions in a similar way, and I think it's also similar in the sense that casinos are built to kind of addict you. You know, they create casinos to suck you in. That's why everything's like bright lights and flashing colors and sounds and everything. And there's sort of reward systems in place to basically turn you into a lab rat that wants to keep hitting the button over and over. And games are actually designed in the same way, especially modern games, especially free-to-play games. Mobile games are probably the worst offender of this, where they build things psychologically into the DNA of the game itself that are basically designed to have you keep coming back over and over again, because that's ultimately what they care about. They want you to play it as much as possible. So yeah, as you know, whenever it comes to big corporates and making money, morals aren't exactly front and center. So yeah, they will keep you coming back as much as they can. So I think gambling serves as a much better comparison point than something like smoking.
Hear me out here. Does the problem that we're seeing with so many gamers becoming somewhat obsessive actually rest at the hands of the developers then? Think about a game like Fortnite. It's free to play, right? But if you want all the cool items, you have two options. Either you pay or you need to grind it out. Things like battle passes ultimately are designed to have you logging in every single day, playing for hours each day to grind through a series of tasks and ultimately unlock gaming items like skins that wouldn't necessarily be available otherwise. Do the game devs need to take a little bit of responsibility here? Are they ultimately creating an army of addicts? Do they need to be stopped?
We've seen legislation start to come in around that, with loot boxes and things like that. After the Battlefront 2 debacle, they started introducing laws in Europe and the EU and things like that. So yeah, I mean, absolutely, this has been going on for years. I mean, we saw that big controversy with CSGO skins as well, where they were basically had like literal gambling sites where you'd put in a skin worth 500 Rand and then you'd try and win one worth 2,000 Rand. Literally gambling for children that's totally unregulated. And all these YouTubers were promoting it, and their target audience was kids, was teenagers, basically. That was who they were marketing to. And that got really messed up, where these gambling websites would basically set them up to win much more than you should. So even the results when they were like live streaming, like playing these gambling things, were fake, and shown to win a lot more. So yeah, like I said, I don't really entrust morality to when it comes to money. I think maybe that's a cynical viewpoint, but I think for the most part, if you have a massive company like Epic, absolutely they have people in there. They have like consultants coming in and saying, this is how you appeal to kids. This is how you get more people to play. This is how you get people to continuously log in. Yeah, absolutely. I don't think necessarily their goal is addiction, but I think their goal is to get you to play as much as possible. And I think sort of problematic amounts of gaming or some kind of addiction is obviously part of that. And yeah, I think even stuff like rarity systems and things like that, the skin is legendary, and kids will talk about it at school and they'll show off their skins, and it sort of has this weird like social status. And I really see this with the kids that I see as well. It becomes all important, to be the guy dressed like a walking banana or whatever. And that's the whole thing. So yeah, absolutely. I do think that they know what they're doing.
I want to circle back again to that CNBC report and something Chris mentioned as well early on, and this idea of legislation. Because this is actually something we're seeing more of globally. China's actually recently implemented a host of laws to try to curb the amount of time kids spend playing games. Reuters filed a really great report outlining the laws in place and how they've come about.
3 hours a week. That's the absolute maximum amount of time under 18s can spend on video games in China, after the country introduced a drastic new limit to combat gaming addiction. China is the world's largest video game market, and authorities here have worried for years about gaming and internet addiction among young people. The National Press and Publication Administration, the regulator that approves video game titles, said the new rules were a response to growing concern that games affected the physical and mental health of children. According to state media, about 62.5% of Chinese minors often play games online. Rising rates of nearsightedness were cited as a concern in 2018. Clinics have even been set up which combine therapy and military drills for those with so-called gaming disorders. Chinese regulators have also targeted the private tutoring industry and what they see as celebrity worship in recent weeks, citing the need to ensure the well-being of children. Gaming limits aren't a completely foreign concept in China. In 2017, Tencent Holdings said it would limit playtime for some young users of its flagship mobile game, Honor of Kings, after complaints from parents and teachers that children were becoming addicted. In 2019, Beijing passed laws limiting minors to less than 1.5 hours of online games on weekdays and 3 hours on weekends, as well as rules on how much minors could spend on virtual gaming items. In July, Tencent rolled out a facial recognition function dubbed Midnight Patrol that parents can switch on to prevent children from using adult logins to get around the government curfew. Online gaming companies must ensure they have put real name verification systems in place, and all titles will eventually need to be connected to an anti-addiction system being set up by the NPPA. The NPPA told state news agency Xinhua it would increase the frequency and intensity of inspections to ensure limits were put in place, step up measures to punish gaming firms that violate the rules, and increase penalties given after inspections.
As a gamer myself, when I hear things like this report that you just listened to, my eyes actually twitch. I mean, are these the sort of draconian measures that we need to put in place? Are they really actually going to curb the so-called addiction? Hell, I'd actually go a step further. Are we seeing a massive misdiagnosis happening when it comes to gaming and what is being classified by a parent or a loved one as an addiction?
I think our concept, so if I'm a parent, and like a boomer parent, like an older parent, right? Not a hip young parent. I think parents have this very skewed idea of what is gaming addiction. If their kid plays a game for 4 or 5 hours in a day, that might sound like a lot, but those same parents are watching 5 hours of TV every night, right? Or something like that. So I think that there's this kind of warped view around how much time should be spent gaming versus not. And I think it's often a pretty difficult measure to sort of figure out where to draw that line. I wouldn't necessarily advocate for these like harsh restrictions and things like that, because I just think that it's much better for people to learn to self-regulate. When you're talking about addiction, you're talking about it having a very negative impact in your life. So if you're a teenager, that means if you're going to school, you're doing all your work, you're spending time with your family, you're maintaining social relationships, all that stuff. It doesn't really matter how much gaming you do then if it's not negatively impacting your life and your experience and your responsibilities. So I don't think the answer is to unilaterally restrict everyone to some arbitrary amount of gaming. I think that we want to teach children to self-regulate, because what happens then when they're adults and you just take the brakes off and they can do whatever they want? Because gaming addiction, or what I like to call problematic gaming, which is kind of like where you're not really addicted, you're still functioning, but it's having a negative impact on your life in a myriad of ways. I think that in that case, that certainly affects adults as well. This is not confined to children. So I think it's much better to, first of all, hold the people responsible to some extent who are doing things like loot boxes and things like that are actually just predatory, because some of it is fun, but some of it is certainly predatory. I think, we've seen things like FIFA games and stuff like that, where the drop rewards and how much money you have to spend to get anything that you want, it's just in the realm of predatory, rather than like, oh, this is a fun value add to the experience. But yeah, I would advocate for parents managing their kids on their own, not with government assistance, but I think to be reasonable as well. The fact is, the world has changed and we're not all outside climbing trees and whatever, because it's just not really realistic. Especially if you think in South Africa, we're concerned about safety. Everyone lives far apart. Both your parents are generally working these days. So a lot of kids, they don't necessarily have a lot of other options for how to interact with other people during the day, how to spend time with friends. A lot of this gaming is done socially. So yeah, I think it's something we have to adapt as we go, and sort of be careful to not go too far.
I suppose the reason I actually have such a knee-jerk reaction to, say, a parent coming up to me to lament their child's obsession with games is because I don't get it. I spend hours playing video games. Hell, I work in gaming. This is my job and my passion. I'm busy doing this podcast right now about, you guessed it, video games. And every time I see this mainstream media story or report, a part of me wonders if we're not just dramatizing things for clicks. Are we just hyping this up because it's cool for clicks? Are the media just fear-mongering an older generation who don't understand a new entertainment medium?
I think there's some level of awareness that can be brought, but I think they're sort of putting the blame in the wrong place as well. I think generally they blame kids, or they blame this generation, or they say, oh, these kids are obsessed with games and things like that. But these kids aren't really the ones who put those structures in place. But yeah, I mean, I think that it's not nearly as much of an issue as they would probably make it out to be. I think most kids game a relatively reasonable amount, and it's not really this thing. But selling fear sells, right? If you can get fear sells clicks. Parents are the most invested people on the planet when it comes to their kids, so they're an easy audience to target and to say, here's the big scary boogeyman you all need to watch out for. So I think we saw the same thing with video game violence, and that's not as cool to talk about anymore. So now the latest thing is gaming addiction, and your child is gonna be a dropout and a hobo because they can't stop playing Fortnite.
Is gaming addiction the thing we should be focusing on, or are we missing the underlying issues that might exist here? Okay, so despite the fact that this clip potentially had the very real clinical psychologist who was sharing insight with me rolling his eyes, I found this interesting advert for a Dr. Phil episode, which originally I wanted to use to showcase media dramatization. But as I listened to this clip, it made me begin to wonder if blaming video games is just a really easy scapegoat for bad parenting.
My 14-year-old son, Nico, is absolutely addicted to his video games.
Let me get the Shuka 6-9. Let me get the Shriek. No!
He'll be on this device for 17 hours a day sometimes. I try to get Nico off video games, tell him that he's limited. He can only have 5 hours a day, and his answer is, oh, no, that's not going to happen. And it's a fight. I asked you hours ago to clean up that mess. What's going on?
Now! Nico is the most spoiled child.
Nico!
Get out!
Stop it!
Get out!
Get off.
Right the now! Nico can get so angry, he will destroy everything in the house, anything in his path, anything that Nico can get his hands on will get destroyed.
What is my computer? He gets what he wants by bullying us and terrorizing this house. He'll pull his hair. Stop it, Nico. He'll start screaming if he's not on his devices. Nico, your mouth! I take him off the internet and he immediately starts throwing things and breaking things, and it's cost us thousands of dollars replacing everything that he's broken. He'll bang his controller. If I don't give him what he wants, I'm gonna break this phone. Nico is not in school right now. He wants to be a YouTuber when he gets older, and he doesn't need school. I couldn't force Nico to get up and go. It was impossible. He's a very large child.
I actually posed this question to Chris to try and figure out, are we maybe focusing on the symptom instead of the cause?
Even if you think of like regular substance abuse, right? Even if you think about drug use or excessive alcohol use, there's very often something else that happening in that person's life that drove them to that thing. And so that thing can become a problem, but there's usually a lot more kind of going on. So yeah, I mean, if your kid is that violent, that oppositional, that poorly behaved, yeah, it's a question of, well, you know, were they like this before when they didn't get their way, or is it specifically confined to gaming? So absolutely, you can get situations where kids do become so invested in games, and that's when you are actually looking at an addiction where they refuse to stop, where they simply can't stop, or become very anxious, irritable, potentially violent if it's taken away from them. So, but yeah, you know, I think you always have to take a holistic view to anything. And I've seen gaming be an easy scapegoat for a lot of parents when there were a lot of other much bigger things in the house. So it's games and cell phones. Parents tend to blame games and cell phones for a lot of things, but oftentimes it's because they don't really want to peek under the hood. They don't really want to look at the dysfunction that exists in the family system already, or they don't really want to confront the issues. So, you know, you'll have parents who sort of say like, oh, you know, I think it's because he's so addicted to his cell phone and that's why he's having these problems. Meanwhile, like the mom's an alcoholic and the dad's abusive, you know what I mean? And that's the kind of stuff that I literally see. So it certainly plays into that, where it's easy to look externally to blame something rather than to look internally and actually look inside your own family system and see if there's something wrong. But it doesn't mean that, you know, this addiction doesn't exist. Like I said at the beginning, absolutely, I think that it will be in the next DSM, and I do think it's something that does exist and that can be quantified. So yeah, there certainly are cases where you would say, okay, this has become a problem and this is actually an addiction and we need to treat it as such.
The focus of this entire conversation has primarily been on kids, which is all well and good, but I do think that there is a bigger discussion. The topic of mental health used to be a bit taboo. Like, you didn't pop into work and announce around the water cooler that you were feeling mad, depressed, and struggling to get up in the morning. But with the rise of social media, that's actually changed. I very often see people I don't even know personally on social share that they're struggling. Hell, if I'm honest, twice now, I've actually had to hunt down contact numbers or real life friends of people online who were posting some scary stuff and who had me worried that they were walking down a dark path. With those online conversations, streamers and people on social media who talk openly about these things and things like it it's obviously become very clear that for many, gaming has become their coping mechanism. And in some cases, these individuals, and I've watched them, and I'm sure you've watched them too, will say that without gaming, they feel like they have nothing. That worries me. In fact, the moment I see a fellow gamer or streamer or content creator talk like this, I feel extremely uneasy and worried for them, despite not knowing them.
So I think gaming can absolutely be a coping mechanism, and like all coping mechanisms, you can overuse them, and then they generally shift into becoming problematic. So, and that's true of almost anything, you know. The guy who comes home from work every day and he finds if he has a couple of beers, it just kind of calms him down, and you know, he feels a little bit less stressed, and it's something that he looks forward to. It's part of his like evening ritual. So that's totally fine if you're having 1 or 2 beers per evening. Once you hitting a 6-pack and sneaking a bottle of whiskey to work, then it's a problem, right? So it's kind of the same sort of thing. We all have our vices. We all have our coping mechanisms. You know, you hear people casually say that they literally can't function without their morning coffee, and it's something that we all accept as normal, in spite of it basically being described as like an addiction. You know, people joke and say, literally don't talk to me until I've had coffee, but they kind of mean it, you know. Interestingly, caffeine use disorder is another thing that's in the potential future disorders. So be careful, coffee lovers. The psychiatrists might be coming for you. But yeah, absolutely, it can become problematic because it is an escape. It can be an effective way of putting things off for a little bit or not worrying about stuff, but you cannot escape forever, and generally ignoring all your issues is a recipe for disaster. So it's something that we absolutely don't encourage. So yeah, if you overuse that coping mechanism, if you use gaming to never confront what you're feeling, to never confront the things in your life, or to avoid all responsibilities, then absolutely it's becoming a huge problem.
And now the hypochondriac in you is worried, right? You're thinking, do I have a problem? Am I using gaming as a crutch? Do I have an actual addiction here that requires professional help? How the hell do you even know?
The criteria for basically all, when it comes to addictions, it's kind of very similar across the board. The only thing that differs is what it is that you're addicted to. But generally, the kind of stuff that you want to look out for is it impacting your functioning in life? Are you staying up late and not sleeping, and then going to work exhausted and sort of failing to do the things that you need to do? Are you not seeing friends or family because you'd rather be gaming, and now it's damaging your relationships? You know, do you have a partner or a spouse that you're creating sort of stress in the relationship because you're neglecting them in order to play games? Have you tried to game less and found yourself unable to do that? Have you found that your pattern of gaming has only increased rather than leveling out or decreasing at any point? So those are the kinds of stuff that you absolutely want to look out for. And for me, I wrote, back when I was still writing for NAG, I wrote an article once on what I call problematic gaming, which is something that I feel like a lot of people fall into. So I think a lot of people listening to this would say, oh, well, that's not me. I still go to work. I still do my stuff. I'm fine. And this article was personal way because I said that I felt like I went through a period in my life in which I'd call myself, my level of gaming, problematic. So not an addiction, but I was still handling all my responsibilities. I was still handling all my relationships, but I found that I was so preoccupied with gaming that I would, for example, like I was at uni at the time, doing my masters, and it was sort of like as soon as the classes were done, I'd rush home and try to fit in as many games as I could before my wife gets home, and then I have to spend time with her. It was this weird thing where it just felt like I was trying to compartmentalize my day into how many games I could fit in. And not only is that like pretty unhealthy and just not really great, I also found that it was sort of costing me the opportunity to just be in the moment, or, you know, if my classmates were hanging out after class, I wouldn't be there hanging out with them and having that experience. I was rushing home to fit in games, and I'd get frustrated if I could only play one game instead of two games or something like that. And that was League of Legends at the time that I was like obsessed with and trying to rank up and whatever. And one day I just deleted it, and I was like, I think this has become a problem. And it was amazing how little I cared about it after I deleted it. Suddenly, nothing about that game mattered, and I actually didn't really care. And I found myself much, much happier overall because I found like I had so much time now. Like, wow, I've got 2 hours to just hang out and do stuff, not like squeeze in 2 games of League, you know? So I think a lot of people potentially fit into that kind of category. And I think that's something that people should try and self-identify. Where do they feel like gaming has taken up too much of their lives? Are they too preoccupied with it? And I think that can become a problem when you are grinding something, like when you're trying to rank up in these games that have ranked systems, multiplayer games, or when you're trying to sort of, like you say, log in and get these rewards or fulfill these things to get, you know, the free in-game currency to buy more stuff, and you're sort of stuck in this loop where you're not necessarily having fun. You're trying to achieve some kind of goal, but it's almost sucked a lot of the fun out of it for you.
I'm going to share a personal story with you now. As I suppose a well-known face in esports, I sometimes get asked to sit on panels. And a few years back, I sat on an introduction to esports type panel at a convention. There was a gaming journalist on the panel, and then there was a wellness expert. And I actually can't remember if this person was a qualified psychologist. I don't believe so. However, I do stand to be corrected. One of the questions posed to the panel was around young gamers and esports, whether it was healthy for them to be competing at a young age. I started to answer before said life coach interrupts me and then proceeds to go on a giant tirade about how dangerous esports is for young minds and how corrupting it can be. She justified this opinion by spending a good 5 minutes going on about the strip clubs you could visit in Grand Theft Auto, a game that, 1, is age restricted at 18, and 2, isn't an esport. Now, don't get me wrong, I do not think in any world that 11-year-old Billy should be playing GTA, much like I don't think a 5 or 6-year-old should be left online playing Fortnite with random strangers. But that isn't the point of the story. The point is, I think there is a complete lack of understanding around gaming. I was on a TV show once that also did a segment on the rise of gaming, and when the show itself came out, there was a clinical psychologist who had been interviewed and was sitting with a patient who was apparently allegedly a recovering drug addict. So the psychologist was treating said addict, and during the show proceeded to announce that gaming had been the gateway drug to this individual's rampant cat use and subsequent addiction. Now, cat is a pretty popular recreational drug in South Africa, where I'm based. I think you can consider it the poor man's cocaine. I actually know nothing about it, but there you go. I just thought this was a really weird jump to make. Like, I'm not a qualified psychologist, psychiatrist, or any sort of medical professional, and I do respect anyone who's studied that long and practiced in those fields. But the two instances that I've mentioned were, for me, indicative of two individuals who had never played a game or really looked into the pastime in any way. Their understanding and their lack of knowledge around games was pretty evident. So if you have a child or a friend, or hell, if you think it's you that might have a gaming addiction, where do you turn? Should you be concerned that the person you go to for help is not necessarily equipped to assist you?
I think that it'll become less of a thing. I think, because I'm 34 now, I remember when I was a kid, gaming wasn't something that everyone did. I was kind of like a gamer, and that kind of used to mean something, and like other kids weren't gamers. Now, every kid, to some extent, plays some amount of video games. Some more than others, for sure, but it's really a very, very common thing now. So I think the more gaming is sort of cementing itself in the mainstream, the less this will be an issue. As of right now, I still think that it is, though. I mean, I had a conversation the other day with like a peer of mine, I guess you say, another psychologist who I'm friendly with, and they said to me, I've got this client and the kid is just so addicted to games. Like, he's so addicted to Fortnite. He plays, and I'm not joking here, Chris, he plays 3 hours a day. And I was kind of like, yeah, I think I play 3 hours of video games a day easily. That's not an addiction, and that's not the way to quantify an addiction either, in my opinion, is hours spent, because I think there's too many variables there. But yeah, it just kind of shows, and this was someone that was young, but they weren't someone who really plays games a lot, and to them that seemed like an enormous amount. And I used the comparison of TV, and I said, would you say someone who watches 3 hours of TV a day is addicted to television? And obviously not. So there's this skewed perception when it comes to gaming. I think that your best bet is, and I know this is very, very biased, but maybe if you want to reach out to someone, try and find someone a little bit younger. They are just more likely to understand, because they are more likely to have grown up with video games, which means they're more likely to understand them and to kind of have played them. So I'm sorry to all my, 60-year-old psychologist gamers who are stomping noobs in Call of Duty every night, but yeah, I just think it's probably potentially a safer bet. You will potentially get a lot of kind of misinformed, or just, I don't even know if misinformed is the right word, just sort of a lack of understanding. And like I say, there's this very skewed perception when it comes to gaming and what qualifies as a lot of gaming and how much time people should spend gaming. So Yeah, I think that people shouldn't speak in absolutes or indefinites. I hate statements like this thing leads to this. I think that's so narrow anyway, and it's just doesn't really quantify a whole human experience.
If you or someone you know is struggling, feeling like your gaming is out of control or worrying about your mental health, please reach out. This is a global podcast, so sharing a direct contact number for help is hard for me, but I hope if you've stuck around till now and are feeling this way, you'll know that it is okay to ask for help. There's a lot to unpack from this episode, and hopefully it's given you a better insight into gaming addiction and maybe the world of gaming as a whole. I do a live chat on twitch.tv/TechGirlZA every Thursday at 1 p.m. SAST. It's called Tech Girl Talks More. If you want to share your thoughts on what you've just heard, join us because that's where we unpack the episodes. You've been listening to Tech Girl Talks, a Playlyst original. My name is Sam Tech Girl Wright, and if you'd like to chat more, you can find me at TechGirlZA on Twitter and Instagram. I drop new episodes of the podcast every Wednesday on all the best platforms to find your podcasts. If you've enjoyed the show, please leave a review and share it with your friends.